Hi, I'm Harry Reeder, Senior Pastor at Briarwood. It's time for another edition of Ask the Pastor. Well, I've just got back from my study sabbatical, so I'm really going to be today answering two questions. One that comes to me, Pastor, what do you do on the study sabbatical? Well, about 8 years ago, my session said, we really want you to be ready and fresh every year for what we're doing from the pulpit and our ministry theme for the year and how it works out. Plus, we want you to get some time for spiritual refreshment. So they carved out a 3-week study sabbatical. Well, Pastor, what do you do? Well, here's what I do. I go away to read. I usually try to read 4 or 5 books. I go away to study, to lay out next year's pulpit schedule. And I go away and work on and pray through how our ministry theme, for instance, this year it's Revive Us Again. And then the ministry theme for the next year, how it can be worked into and permeate and penetrate all of the life of Briarwood. So that's what I do at that time, as well as some rest, as well as some exercise, as well as spending some time with Cindy. And so that's what I do, miss 2 Sundays for those 3 weeks. So it's a wonderful time, and I'm grateful for that. This year, I've come back prepared for next year's expositional series in 1 Peter. We are going to be covering in the coming weeks and throughout this coming year, we're going to be looking at 1 Peter. Now, why 1 Peter and what will we be doing? That was the next question that's come to me. Well, 1 Peter, if you'll know, we've been studying what does it mean to be revived. Revive us again. We've looked at the revivals, some of the revivals in the Bible, the principles of revival. Well, when the church and the Christian is revived, how do they live, and how do they live in a culture in which the culture itself wishes to marginalize the Christian and the Christian church, a hostile culture, an increasingly pagan culture? Well, I believe there is an epistle that is written that is there to give us specific direction, what to expect and how to live in a moment such as a hostile culture and being considered as exiles or aliens in that culture. And that's the first epistle of Peter. And that's what we're going to be studying. So I'm looking forward to it. We actually begin this coming Lord's Day, which is August the 13th, and looking forward to it. And it will run for a number of sermons throughout the fall and the winter and into the spring. And so I want to encourage you to invite your friends. In other words, here's one of the keys. The elect exiles. That's what we are called in First Epistle. Elect exiles. In the Bible, when the people of God were exiled, it was an act of judgment. But in the New Covenant, not the Old Covenant, but in the New Covenant, the Christians are not exiled in judgment, they're exiled in their salvation. In other words, we don't have one nation that we are in. We are in a royal spiritual nation, the kingdom of God, but we reside in many nations. When God brought judgment upon Israel, he dispersed them as exiles to Assyria, to Babylon, previously, of course, to Egypt. But when God saves his new covenant people, he draws them from all the nations, yet he leaves them in those nations and tells them to be in the world, but not of the world. In other words, we live as aliens. We live as exiles in the kingdoms of this world. So our citizenship is in the kingdom of heaven, yet we reside as sojourners, aliens and exiles in the kingdoms of this world. And how do we live out our kingdom commitment to King Jesus in those kingdoms when those kingdoms become hostile to us? Peter deals with all the issues. How do you make a defense for the faith? How do you live? How do you develop your family? How do you work? How do you pray? How do you live in light of the second coming? How do you suffer? All of those things are dealt with in 1 Peter. Some people ask me sometimes, they say, Pastor, do we live like the believers did in Babylon, or do we live like they did in Jerusalem? Is it the Jerusalem option? Is it the Babylonian option? Let me give you another option. Here's the option, the Bithynian option. To the exiled elect in Bithynia, Peter says, in the inspiration of the Spirit, This is how we live. Join me. Let's work through this glorious epistle of 5 chapters. How then shall we live as exiled elect for Christ in the kingdoms of this world? They want us to see ourselves as outsiders. We know we're outsiders, but we're not going to live on the outside. We're going to live on the inside of that culture for Christ, but not let that culture get inside of us. I'll see you each Lord's Day for 1 Peter, the Gospel according to St. Peter.